This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube and wish to listen to this program as a podcast, you may click the link below to your favorite podcast platform. This talk is with Sarah Olive, Director of Research, School of Educational Sciences, Bangor University. Sarah is currently on research leave for a year and has begun serving on the faculty of Kobe Women's College in Japan as a visiting professor. In October 2020, Sarah was kind enough to help us start this series with this first installment. Much has happened since, so we have invited her back to learn how she has adjusted to life teaching in a Japanese university and to hear about her recent and forthcoming work on a variety of subjects, including an edited edition in progress entitled Hot Shakespeare, Cool Japan. This series is funded with institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Sarah, good morning.
Morning, Tom. Ohayo gozaimasu.
Oh, it's so good to see you again. And thank you so much for returning to our little Shakespeare program here. Many of us in Japan in particular will be delighted to see you again on video and with any luck, maybe in person sometime in the coming months. You, my dear, were the courageous first guest on this series. Back a year and a half ago, which seems like 10 years ago. And in fact, 2018 seems closer in time because the pandemic had this strange time warp thing that is coming, I think, into my mind, but also everybody else I talked to. But back then, I had no idea what I was doing. And maybe I still don't. I asked you back today because the Sarah of today has in some ways become a good bit different from the Sarah of a year and a half ago when we last talked, because so much has happened. I have a lot of questions to ask you about your recent research and grant work, which includes work on global Shakespeare with a focus on education, of course, an interest in YA or young adult novels and stuff, Gothic studies, and something on the front burner about hot Shakespeare and cool Japan we'll get to. But before we get to that, and go to your research and teaching, let's start with where you were in the physical world 18 months ago and tell us what has happened. Many things have happened since.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you're right that it seems more like a decade ago. So 18 months ago, I was at the University of York, working in the education department there. And I had an offer around this time last year to come to Kobe College, Kobe Jogakuin, as a visiting professor. And it seemed like this beautiful way to travel during the pandemic at a time when we, at that point thought maybe travel would never begin again. I couldn't really imagine getting on a long haul flight again. So I did the sensible thing and took them up on that offer and said, wow, if we can make it happen, if, in March 2022, it's going to be allowed that I get a visa and that I get on the plane. Absolutely. So the seeds of this trip now were sown as early as that. Subsequently over the summer period, really in 2021, I also had an offer from Bangor University, from the education department there, to take up a position. And I started that in September 2021. So a physical move from England to Wales, lots of cultural and linguistic shifts going on as well, because Bangor is a bilingual university that foregrounds Welsh and English medium provision, and makes that available across very many courses. So it's not just for the linguists. So there's been a fair bit of adapting to do, but it's positioned me quite well for coming out to another bilingual department, the English literature department here at Kobe College.
Okay, so our international audience understands. So many of us have spent time in the UK. Many of you, of course, you had, much of your life, and some of our listeners in Japan. Though it may seem much smaller, in the UK seems like this island off the coast of Europe, so in some ways. And I wanted to make the salient point that when you moved you were in Stratford teaching at York, and it's a very comfortable area there in the Midlands of England, going there to the north and so forth. The move to Bangor, even though it doesn't seem geographically that much to us, is an enormous move. You're moving to another culture completely.
Mm-hmm.
And you're, like you said, you're in a bilingual environment and people speak Welsh. And Welsh is a different language. I know from my visits to Wales. So you've done this cross-cultural travel, and now again you've moved to Japan, where I am certain, and I have many stories from my early days. Let's see, you've been here how many weeks in Japan?
3 weeks now.
3 weeks. Okay, so the honeymoon is still on. I would give you another 3 weeks to a month, to where at one point you're going to say, like I did, I wish they would just write toothpaste in Roman letters on the tube at the convenience store or the pharmacy, because I just don't know what toothpaste is. And your host, that would be this guy, I think I bought when I first came to Japan, I bought makeup remover.
Oh.
I just didn't know, and I didn't know how to ask. I wasn't sure exactly, and I didn't know at that time. I probably could have just said toothpaste and pointed to my teeth, but I think that I brushed my teeth with makeup remover.
Ooh.
So those types of things.
It might do a similar job. You never know. It's going to taste a whole lot worse than
the people here are so friendly and are so clean and nice, but they just need some instruction on making toothpaste, and language also, and that sort of thing. And so there is an adaptation period. There's a honeymoon period, and then there's a time when a lot of people say that they just get to where they just are tired. It's called culture shock, but really it's more fatigue than shock. And should that happen to you, you have such a great energy level and you're so positive, it may not happen at all. But I wanted to guarantee you that it comes back up. Right. It takes a little bit of time, but it comes back up and you get to where you like things again. And you're in such a beautiful area. Kobe is a port city that celebrates its port. Unlike Tokyo, you could live in Tokyo for years and not even know that you're really in a port, right? But Kobe celebrates, they embrace the port.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know what you mean about the fatigue, in the sense that, like, trying to decode, if you can't necessarily read something, if you find yourself suddenly illiterate in a department store or a grocery store, and you are trying to decode all this visual information instead to get clues. So with the toothpaste, you're maybe looking for something kind of blue or green, or with pictures of mint leaves on it, or with pictures of teeth or a smile, or and actually I think this is a really useful experience, and a reminder for me around looking at things like Shakespearean theatre, right? So it's a reminder to maybe not solely depend on things that you can understand by reading or listening, but to hone into body language, to gesture, to facial cues, to tone, all those sorts of things. So all these experiences of sitting through faculty meetings where I can understand the occasional word, but otherwise I'm waiting for people's sort of pauses or gestures. Yeah, it's so relevant for Shakespeareans.
Yeah, I remember it went something like this for me. Next Monday, blah, 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 blah. Last week, blah, 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 blah. Next year, blah, 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 because I'd learned my years and so forth. 163, blah, 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 da, da, da. And this particular professor's name, da, 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 da. but it fills in. It's like this enormous jigsaw puzzle with certain pieces that fill in over time. But it's also, when you're in a faculty meeting, you're talking with people who have been acclimated to the names of departments and the names of specific forms that are not that transferable. Like, for instance, if one of my Japanese colleagues sat in a Kobe college and faculty meeting, they might say, I don't know what that form is, or what this department is, or where it is on campus, right? So there's that too. But all of those things go with the territory. And have you had a chance to start classes yet? Have you begun classes?
Yeah, absolutely. I started last week, and Mondays are my Shakespeare day. So isn't that a great way to start the week? I have third years who they've had a tough time, right? These are students who have never had a year on campus. So this is their very first year on campus. So in some senses, they are as kind of new and as learning of the physical environment of Kobe College as I am. Sure, they've got way better linguistic capabilities than me. They might recognize each other's names from, Zoom interactions, Zoom classes, but this is the first time that they're meeting each other as well. So yeah, we kicked off with some work on actually the little 4-line curse on Shakespeare's tombstone, which might seem like a weird way to start things off, kind of back to front. And then, of course, you've got maybe now slightly old-fashioned debates about, is that really Shakespeare? It's a little bit grubby, that language. It's a little bit, not worthy of this esteemed poet. But actually, I thought just to start with something self-contained, and for these students, they're expressing a huge interest in Shakespeare's life and times. So it kind of ties in nicely to some material culture and also some textual studies. We've been able to talk about things like the spellings on that curse and why they appear in particular variations. So I was really surprised by how much you can get out of 4 lines. You can get 90 minutes seminar discussion, no problem.
Yes, you're doing Shakespeare and his age,
Mm-hmm.
and theater studies, and then in the next semester, and
Mm-hmm.
children's and young adult literature in the second semester. And some probably there will be a little bit of Charles and Mary Lamb, and or
Yes.
something similar to
How
that.
could you have guessed, Tom?
Well, no, I am. I think that I'm being visited by some kind of god of history, and so, because the number of people I talk to internationally, and this is in Taiwan, Japan, Africa, in African Eastern Africa, in of course the North America. What people who came to Shakespeare with translations or with the English of Charles and Mary Lamb. And it's amazing how much influence that little book had on the history of Shakespearean reception. So maybe I'll write the article, or maybe you can do it.
Hey, maybe we should do a collaboration.
Okay, we could do that. That would be wonderful. I'd love it.
I have
So
heard of this long influence, partly through working with students who are, examining students writing about Shakespeare in Korea, but also a colleague in Taiwan, Wing Bozo. Her work is looks a lot at how Taiwanese children's publishing, Taiwanese children's picture books are still kind of, they're not necessarily translating Charles and Mary Lamb, but adapting it or kind of bouncing off it.
yeah, I don't know if you've run across Alexa Jobin in your you have. Okay, and she's part of this series also, but she's an American, but she was born and raised in Taiwan, and she's the one who said that it was Charles and Mary Lamb in Chinese. So very, very interesting stuff. She's doing some very interesting work, as are you. Now, you put here in a couple of things that you sent me that you came over, and I wanted to make sure that we had the Twitter handle here, but you came over on a Welsh dragon, which is good. And so you're, yeah.
He's sat up there just keeping an eye on me, and maybe he's translating me into Welsh as we go.
your hashtag is drag, DRAIG.
Yeah.
And that's the Welsh for dragon, which is also the English for things like drag, drag queen, or drag racing, which has a drag racing. I think there's a show in America that's you're either with the good old boys with cans of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, watching a car zoom off. I mean, it's cool stuff actually. Or you're on the TV series where they talk about the drag race, and I forget who the character. I'm so out of touch with American TV.
RuPaul.
Yeah, RuPaul. That's it, RuPaul and Drag Race. Thank you so much. Yeah,
I kind of like the idea of drag race, because there is a little I in this one as well. So you've got DRAIG.
IG. Yes,
I do think we could have drag race and drag racing with this little dragon guy would be fantastic.
That's wonderful. I'm going to go to what you have mentioned first, because there's you are. They need to give make another word for multitasking for you and others I've interviewed here, because it goes beyond multitasking, and I don't know how you keep these things straight, but you do. And so you're the lead editor of, how is this pronounced? Jeunesse?
Jeunesse, yeah, you're pretty much bang on the money.
Young people text, cultures, international culture. Tell us a little bit about this. This is a journal on young adult, or even younger, maybe.
Yeah, people. Definitely. It goes right down to babies, infants, children, really the moment that you can start being involved in texts and cultures, which, frankly, could be, being read to in utero these days is obviously one of the pieces of advice that women are given. This came about because I had been just one of the editors. It's a very collaborative journal, the way it works, the way editorial decisions are made. And I'd been on there maybe for a few months, and a vacancy came up for a lead editor who still works very collaboratively, but helps to head up the meetings, helps to spearhead policy, those sorts of things.
Well, and I'm sure they were drawn to your work in young adult vampires, particularly in Romeo and Juliet fiction, right? And I wanted to mention this journal is out of the University of Toronto Press. Is that correct?
Yeah, so absolutely.
That's Toronto, of course. The very, 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 very fine press. And so, yes, vampires, Romeo and Juliet fiction.
Yeah, it certainly helped that I'd had this long interest in really Shakespeare for young adults, as you say. I'd kind of thrown the Gothic into the mix thanks to our mutual friend Samantha Landau at University of Tokyo. You were saying, Tom, you don't know how I keep track of it. I'm not entirely sure how I manage to keep these balls in the air and also find connection points between them, because they sound slightly disparate. They sound quite unwieldy, but I kind of managed to link them all together. So having the Gothic with the vampires, with the Romeo and Juliet, which I'm not sure how many people will realize this, but it's an incredibly popular text, a spin-off for writing about vampires and zombies and all sorts of supernatural phenomena. Maybe it is some of those slightly weird elements with people coming back to life at the last minute, and it's a popular thing to think about in terms of blood feuds, so perhaps having wars between vampires and slayers and werewolves kind of is a natural fit or a natural home for Romeo and Juliet in the 21st century.
It seems so, and very much so. I'm not completely up on it, but what manga and anime in Japan do with Romeo and Juliet is fascinating. Where you have a system here where you don't have this reverence for the iconic, we think of 18th century Victorian Shakespeare and the university Shakespeare. There is that, but the artist and the readers, the young adult readers, the artists do show reverence not to this icon, but to the source material. They see potential there, but then they bend it to shape to their young adult audience. And I've just finished a paper in collaboration with Kyoko Matsuyama and Reina Endo, my student, where they, of course, know all of this stuff. And I'm the senior colleague who assimilated it, but finished a paper on that fascinating stuff. And so you wanted to make sure that people out there knew that they were open for articles, to consider articles, particularly in, young people, texts, cultures, and international and cross-cultural subjects. So
yeah, absolutely. If anyone is working on topics around Shakespeare and children, Shakespeare and young people, it could be, pop songs, it could be video games, for example, that incorporate some element of Shakespeare's plays. Please throw those into Jeunesse when you have them handy.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And I think there's been the reemergence of a very fine, a little bit long-standing company, Children's Shakespeare troupe in Tokyo, and Miss Endo, who's now at the Shakespeare Institute, knows about that. So I'll ask her about that. Maybe that's something she could do because she seems to know quite a lot about it. So you are, let's move ahead a little bit. We could talk about that forever. We could talk about all of this stuff forever, but you co-established the Gothic Association of Asia, GAA.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
won funding. You have a grant. That's another big part of your portfolio, Sarah, is that you seem to be an expert in grant writing. And wow, good for you.
Yeah, it's not the most pleasurable writing to do, is it? Let's be honest, but it is the kind of writing.
I spent the better part of this weekend, and I'm going, I have to go into another part of my brain and make this clear, to somebody who is fair. You have to put it in terms that they understand, the reviewers. But yes, you got this grant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it tests another part of your brain. I like to do it with a podcast on in the background. So, this could be another way for people to pair up their interests in grant writing and also your podcast. Yeah, I had co-funding with, again, Samantha Landau, with Lee Shin Shu at National Chengchi University, Kasharan Kuta at Chulalongkorn in Thailand, and also Chiho Nakagawa, who is way closer to my new home here in Kansai. And we were working to establish a Gothic in Asia association. So I like to think of it as making the same sound as the crows in the morning here. Every morning I get woken up by this.
Yes, you do.
So we have this GAA, Gothic Association of Asia, and the website is about to launch. I think in the next couple of months, it will definitely be out. And really through the leadership of Lee Shin Shu, we also have another pot of funding that we hope will lead to events. So for those listeners whose interest intersect with the Gothic or horror adaptations of Shakespeare or folk horror, please watch out for those events and get involved with us.
And it also includes Kasha Ansuta, from Chulalongkorn in Thailand, and Samantha, our friend Samantha Landau, the Tokyo University of Tokyo, and Chiho Nakagawa, Nara, in the Kansai region. They're near where you are. And a PhD student, probably from York, Catherine Smith or Katie Smith.
Yeah. Absolutely. Katie has been, so I had, I think this was a separate pot of funding for a York student intern. So Katie, who I have known through undergraduate as a master's student and now as a doctoral student, she's just finishing up now, came on board to do our web design, basically. So we have many people who are very good at the internet and creating websites, and I am not one of them. WordPress is not a language that I speak. So I know that not everybody has a 4,000 word paper in their drawer over this pandemic period. And indeed, it's been incredibly disruptive for people that have caring responsibilities, for example. But also it's been incredibly tough on our mental health and well-being to keep researching during the pandemic. But I did want to say that there's another way that people can get involved in this special issue, because as an editor, I'm going to be focusing in my writing on the special relationship, as I'm coining it, between the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham, and Shakespeareans in Japan. And many of you will know that that's where I came from in terms of my doctorate, as the Shakespeare Institute. And it's where I first met and connected with Japanese scholars, with students who were visiting from Japan, who were completing their masters and their doctorates, and also with Japanese students being engaged with performance and direction of student Shakespeare productions, I'm going to say. So I've got a short Google form, and any of the listeners here, scholars, students, or practitioners, whether they are here in Japan or whether they're listening from Europe or America, wherever in the world, who've built a bridge in any way between the Shakespeare Institute and Japan, and who'd like to share their memories of academic, theatrical, social exchanges, any interactions really, are welcome to follow that link, either on my Twitter account, they could do it on my academia.edu page, or just drop me an email if that's preferred, and I can send the link for that Google form. What it does is just ask a few questions about, hey, who are you? What's your relationship with the Shakespeare Institute, if you are a staff or student member in Japan, or if you are a member of the Shakespeare Institute or a graduate of the Shakespeare Institute, what's your connection with Japan? Have you been funded to come out and do some research here? Have you collaborated with a Japanese scholar? Do you do translation work for Japanese theatres, for example? Those sorts of things. So there's just a few short prompts to write about your sense of the connection between Japanese Shakespeare and the Shakespeare Institute, or vice versa. So I'm very aware that this is a bilateral relationship with a flow of cultural traffic and academic traffic that goes completely in two ways, if not more.
Well, your impetus to write about Chloe Gong's duology, these violent delights and our violent ends.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And a very cosmopolitan Shanghai gangster pandemic horror retelling of Romeo and Juliet. This is your work. We're kind of going to.
Yeah.
So you have been, one thing inspires another. So you get this grant, and then you somehow receive this impetus to move into this particular work, the Chloe Gong's duology, and which is a reworking a Gothic and, let's say, fearful reworking. Well, Romeo and Juliet is fearful. It is fearful, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it would seem that an adaptation reworking is very appropriate for it to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think Romeo and Juliet taps into some of our worst fears. So, for example, the fear of losing your children, before your time comes, before you pass, those sorts of things. And it takes that and marries it with a pandemic situation. And I think Chloe Gong speaks about her work on Varsha Panjwani's Women in Shakespeare podcast, sometime in the third series. And I need to find out more about whether she's writing before the pandemic, whether this is a response to the pandemic. It happens almost adjacently to it. So her two books were published, I think, 2020 and 2021. And it deals with a kind of fantasy, monsters and horrible crawling insects spreading this disease and spreading fear and misinformation as well about how to respond to these monsters and insects flowing around Shanghai through all the different quarters, whether that's the French concession, the British, the Chinese, the White Russians. So it's actually a great lesson in Asian history as well, because it deals with the rise of nationalism, all sorts of things there in Shanghai.
Is she located in Shanghai?
I cannot remember. I would say that she herself is probably fairly cosmopolitan, is my impression. I have to say I haven't engaged enough with her biography, but it deals with things like, people who studied in France and would gain their kind of professionalism as a modern dancer there. It deals with people acquiring flapper culture from the UK and the US and bringing that back to 1920s Shanghai. So I think she herself is a polyglot and multicultural, intercultural, able person.
Yeah, well, you prompted me here to give your thoughts with the colleagues and listeners in Shanghai, which has had a big resurgence recently in the COVID-19, and I hope they're on the tail end of that.
Absolutely.
Very, very sad stuff. I mean, just when the rest of us feel this, larger light at the end of the tunnel. But let's get back to Sarah. And I want to go to a recent book chapter, Vanguard Taste and Fashion Spirit, Feminist Responses to 21st Century Zeitgeist in Young Adult, Vampire, Romeo and Juliet, Romeo and Juliet text. That was in an edition on Young Adult Gothic Fiction, published in Wales, the University of Wales Press.
Yeah, that was a pure coincidence. That was to do with the fact that they're pretty good at publishing both on young people's fiction and culture and also on Gothic. They have like a good Gothic series going. And the editors are two Australians, Michelle Smith, Christine Maruzzi. So it kind of taps into all these different, the time I spent in Australia, except I never knew Michelle or Christine then. They come out of Melbourne. They work out of Melbourne, Victoria. And I got to know them subsequently. And we have friends in common who work on Shakespeare. So again, there's this collision of Gothic and Shakespeare and kind of young adult culture that has just been really productive. I guess I had begun to work on Romeo and Juliet adaptations that involve vampires, and serendipitously had this opportunity to pop the book chapter out for them. But again, it's another lovely marriage of these three big research interests that I'm having at the moment.
It's so interesting to me recently, because when you say YA in Japan, and I think throughout a large part of the world, you're primarily, and you're talking about feminist responses, young women are the readers, largely in Japan, not young men. Young men go to games, and it's very gender segregated that way. And there are young men who, of course, read manga and so forth, but these YA novels that take on Shakespeare and the theme ostensibly of love, right? That's what people think of, romance and love, and Shakespeare is love. And then there's Shakespeare in Love, the movie. And so my students are surprised every year when we start out with the street fight over basically somebody popping the bird to another guy. He bites his thumb. I have to explain that's the same as, up yours or whatever. And young boys who are, what does the prince say? Out of airy nothingness, the entire town explodes into a street fight. And so there's this disappointment at the beginning of, where's the love story? This is, and of course the young men in my class are all, cool. And some of the young women too. But the thing is that your audience for YA is largely feminine, and I guess we include in that trans or any number of reaches along the spectrum of gender or whatnot. But young people who identify strongly with the notion of true romance, and then get very, very drawn in by the whole vampire kind of Twilight thing.
And I've noticed some glimmers of
Yeah.
recognition already when I'm talking to my students here at Kobe College about what I do. And it's always great to be able to mention, say, the Twilight Saga and see that glimmer of recognition, and maybe just another way of having a hook into Shakespeare. So to talk about the way that Stephanie Meyer reprocesses or alludes to Romeo and Juliet or Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre, just kind of gives them that additional hook or kind of point of connection with Shakespeare. So it's been nice to kind of have that to sort of trail some of the things that I'll be talking about in class. And I think, yeah, one of my kind of arguments has been around the way that both vampires and Romeo and Juliet in these texts fruitfully collide in order to have discussions about sexuality, about consent, about violence within intimate relationships, those sorts of things. So, there are a couple of ways of working through this tricky territory, and some areas that can be very difficult for young people to have discussions around. And all of these texts, all of these authors are kind of coming together in these reworkings to kind of help people have a way to talk about these, or to think them through, or to have some discussion about, how do we feel when Romeo does this? Or how do we feel about, I don't know, things like age differences, those sorts of things?
Yeah. Well, also, I think that you're on to something here. These are wildly popular in Japan and throughout the world, and not always Shakespeare. But to parallel this with the Shakespearean period, you may have picked up a quarto version of the first quarto of Hamlet to kind of see what that guy was saying, which we now consider to be not a complete version of Hamlet, but the first quarto right now, a copy of it would be very valuable, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And so you wonder which ones of these books 400 years from now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Whether, it might be Twilight, or that might be lost to history. It might be something we don't really notice. But I think people are largely, widely, popularly believe that there is popular and there is literature. And what I have seen, even in my own life, is that a lot of things that were considered, and we think of a lot of bands, musicians, and so forth, as just throwaway stuff, right? Some years later, suddenly it's canonical, and literature goes that way. Songs, what happened with poetry? Well, it went into the recording studio, and there are these people who stick and these people who don't. And somewhere in your research, you're going to find that thing that does stick and marks an entire epoch, really, a generation of people who encountered these themes during their formative years.
Yeah, and absolutely. And, Twilight's a really interesting case because it looks right now like that's going to be the one that sticks, but it's also the one that has a lot of, it produces a lot of strong and polarizing feelings, right? About the messages it's giving young women, the messages it's giving particularly around things like sex before marriage and whether that should happen or not happen, whether it's progressive or regressive. So there is a lot of debate, and I guess it means it could go either way. And one of the things I've enjoyed doing through that article is to flag up, although I haven't said this necessarily explicitly in the article, a couple of other authors who I think retell Romeo and Juliet, and with the help of vampires, in much more kind of funky and progressive ways. So, they might have, for example, a young male character stepping in to diffuse an argument in a home, in a domestic violence situation. And I kind of have real great respect for the author of that work for kind of being able to show representations of, oh, well, this is how men can step up and be involved and not be bystanders. And it just feels really, maybe to me, more progressive, more kind of aspirational, what we should be aspiring to in society and culture than necessarily Edward and Jacob.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking what you just said made me think of what we were writing about a series by I'm forgetting her given name, Yoshimura, but having to do with Twelfth Night as the source. That in the Japanese title, about the bad-tempered Duke, in that particular work. Both of the things that you're talking about. There is convention. There's the idea that the young woman who approaches this bad-tempered man, powerful, melancholy, sad for various reasons, can somehow repair him. Okay, very, very conventional theme, but in the same time, both of them are androgynes. There's gender bending throughout the entire work that seems to suggest that the way she does this is through acquiring the role of a traditional male to draw him in. And he becomes more effeminate traditionally and somehow they meet in the middle. And then, of course, in the end, it goes straight back to convention, right? So as to leave you on safe ground socially. So that is interesting to me.
Oh yeah, and certainly, thinking about kind of gender and performing gender, I am so happy that some of my students already mentioned that they'd seen Takarazuka adaptations of Shakespeare. So it could be of Romeo and Juliet, or it could be the 400th anniversary kind of celebration of Shakespeare's life that I think happened 2016, is it that long ago? And so, these students already being able to say, well, I have engaged with Shakespeare, but it's been filtered through Takarazuka, through this Japanese medium, with this all-female troupe, really not that far away from me here, 10 minutes on the train? Probably to Takarazuka. Yeah. So I know that Matsuyama sensei is interested in those adaptations, as well as things like Psychopaths and the 12th Night reversioning, which I don't know the name of either, but yeah.
Well, I just wrote on it and I should have it fresh in my mind, but there's the Japanese and English, and the English, let's don't worry about that. It is what it is. And it's interesting what in fact, the author, the adapter does with these stories, just endlessly interesting. And I want to turn a little bit here to your work your work, your background is both in education and where you were in that field, in the field of education at Cambridge, and you also did your work at the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford. So you have this two-tiered approach to education Shakespeare, and then you've moved on to kind of some other things. But you have done a book with Kohei Uchimaru, and Uchimaru sensei is a associate of mine, a very, very bright scholar, along with Adele Lee, and she is known for her recent work on Shakespeare in East Asia, and Rosalind Fielding. But the title of the book is Shakespeare and East Asian Education, and that's out from Palgrave. And I think it has some wonderful resources in there and very, very interesting.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you mentioned Alexa Juban earlier, and she is the editor of the series that it sits within. So
yeah, there it is.
The
that was dumb.
Shakespeare Palgrave series. Well, I nearly pulled you in this direction when you mentioned Alexa a little while ago, but I thought, nah, I'll leave it and I can hook back to it later on. Yeah, it was fantastic. So Uchimaru sensei obviously is known for his work, particularly on the evolving policy of Shakespeare in Japanese education and the way that tuition about Shakespeare has evolved through over a century of textbooks now published in Japan for teaching Shakespeare in, for example, higher education. So that's what his chapter focuses on. Adele Lee, as you mentioned, she's worked a lot on East Asian Shakespeare in Hong Kong. She now publishes quite a lot on accentism in relation to performances, productions of Shakespeare. And her work was particularly focused on secondary schooling in Hong Kong and things like the use of active methods, which is another of my interests. So these dramatic or practical pedagogies for approaching Shakespeare. And then Rosalind Fielding, also from the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham. Her chapter hooks back directly to something you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, that Shakespeare for Children series coming out of Japan. I think in a way, a kind of offshoot of Ninagawa's theatre, in that some of the practitioners, the directors involved, had worked with or were trained by Ninagawa. So it was really exciting to me when you said this is maybe coming back to life. That series will be kind of revived, because I had no idea. But for readers that are interested, Rosie does a kind of take on the history of that series, how it came about. She examines some of the key choices, so the use of a chorus in it, the use of a kind of figure presenting Shakespeare, those sorts of things, and also thinking about the way that children respond to it, and that it's tailored to children, and that you could maybe sit it alongside or do some comparison of it with things like the Playing Shakespeare Deutsche Bank Shakespeare's Globe productions in the UK, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, this is just wonderful stuff. I wanted to add to this a supplemental that it is too, I know that I'm going to say Professor Uchimaru. We know him in Japan as Uchimaru Sensei, but for our international audience, Professor Uchimaru has done work on trying to push forward the idea of teaching literature in secondary, what in America is called secondary school, in middle school, high school, let's say, which it is not. Literature is not taught in Japanese secondary education. And of course, Professor Uchimaru argues that it should be, and he's there with some of our friends, Hirohisa Igarashi, Amy Hamana. The list goes on. Of course, Professor Matsuyama, and Suematsu Sensei, and some very, and of course, I don't know if we together, with my Japanese colleagues, could push something. It would take so institutionalized and set, but that is. The Japanese word is zannen. It's a shame, because your students at Bangor or at York or in Stratford, they come in, probably some of them prejudiced against learning even more Shakespeare, boom, 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 all the way through. But they do come in with an understanding of what literary study is all about. And my Japanese students do not. You kind of have to start from scratch, and the ones who get it, they really get it, and then there are others who just get through some other way.
That's so interesting to me, because whilst I'm here and whilst I'm teaching, I am attempting what in educational research we call autoethnography, and it's also used by anthropologists, but a lot of reflexivity, so reflecting on how my classes went, why I planned things a particular way, why I chose a particular passage from Shakespeare to teach in class, why I thought that would be good, how did it go, that sort of thing. And already I've started looking at the exit tickets that my students put up on our virtual learning environment from our class last week. And I'd asked them to tell me a bit about their first encounters with Shakespeare, what they knew about him already, and what they want to learn, because I want to be able to tailor the course a little bit to their particular interest in Shakespeare. So already I am getting some of those experiences with Shakespeare that you mentioned coming up. So if he's been done in high school, it's not really as literature. It's through perhaps the music department looking at the overture from Romeo and Juliet, or it's from world history class where it's maybe about ye old England and Stratford-on-Avon and the history of the Elizabethan stage, for example. And I know that Professor Uchimaru and my chapter also in the Shakespeare in East Asian education book do look at the pressure on literature academics in Japan, Shakespeare academics, you know, obviously at the heart of that, in terms of communicative English and a shift away from using literature as something that you can explore language through, that you can explore how language works, how it creates emotions, how it can be used to communicate, how it captures linguistic evolution, those sorts of things. So yeah, I don't really know where to go with this. I lose my thread, but it certainly connects to the work of so many Shakespeareans here. And I think it connects to some of the challenges involved in teaching literature in Japan when young people all over the world are maybe coming away from canonical literature, maybe engaging with lots of other literatures, maybe producing and publishing their own literatures through you know, blogs or through websites that share young people's fiction. But yeah, it sure captures some of those challenges.
Well, yeah, and what you're saying is not only is there not a move to do literary study and let's say cultural study, cross-cultural study, those things that build critical thinking skills and to build, they're very practical at the very bottom line. I mean, they give people self-confidence, because when you can think through things and analyze things, that builds self-confidence. And there are hardly, you know, people who are good in math feel that when they can get something right. But there are other areas of the brain you want to cultivate. And the great mathematicians, of course, have both of these areas highly formed and developed. But not only is there no push really of significance to do this, there has been recently a push to just get rid of the humanities in higher education. That came up a few years back, I think more like 7 years ago now. The years pass so quickly sometimes, but there was great pushback on that. And when you start going to the University of Kyoto, and saying we're going to get rid of Japanese studies of the Edo period, of the Heian period, and you go to the University of Tokyo, you're dealing with some very, very powerful forces there. And the Ministry of Education, that branch of it, is a very large, that proposed that. And in fact, a couple of national universities knocked out their entire School of Humanities. I don't know where they're, that stopped very quickly. And there was an apology released in kind of Japanese fashion. That was, there was a kind of proofreading error in the you know, documentation we produced. And I'm sure somebody, there was, you know, some kind of thing going on, but we'll never know. It all happened behind the scenes. But you can see what happens. Can you imagine in the UK, right? The first line of defense would be the elite universities, where there would be somebody in the Houses of Parliament. They go, "Are you out of your mind?" And the public,
well, you'd hope so, Tom, but I don't necessarily have that confidence in our current government necessarily. I think there are certainly parallels around politics in relation to education, humanities, culture, and where they should be placed and who should be funding them. I'm sorry to say that I think that this is the case, but there are possibly more similarities than people might realize between recent and or current Japanese and British governments. But also, for example, you were talking about maybe some pulling back from the teaching of literatures and cultures from other parts of the world, from outside Japan, and certainly in the UK in the context of Brexit. But even before Brexit, our education minister at the time, Michael Gove, deleted pretty much study of world literature. So, I grew up doing things like, okay, I know I'm a geek, but I used to read Tolstoy because I thought those were great, like stories, huge romances. I loved the characters in them. Anna Karenina just fits so well with other 19th century literature that I was reading at the time. And it gave me this curiosity about, I don't know, tea cultures in Russia, or about going to the opera in Russia in the 19th century, those sorts of things. And suddenly, or not so suddenly, over a kind of protracted period of time now, it feels like the UK government has been closing school children's doors on literatures from other parts of the world, whether it's Russia, whether it's reading literature in translation. So there are huge amounts of literature in translation from Japan that are really popular with readers in the UK. So Murakami would be an obvious example, but also more recent authors and young women authors. So, for example, the novel that translates in English as Breasts and Eggs has currently been all over the Bookstones, Waterstones bookshelves, W.H. Smith bookshelves, but our government is not supporting, the study of those translated texts. So, yeah, there are some sad parallels around nationalism and kind of getting inward looking and not getting excited by experiencing these other cultures, which I think is doubly a shame at a time of pandemic, and when we can't do necessarily international conferences, when we can't necessarily have research and mobility to a great extent, and young people can't travel and do those exchanges or do those years as international students that they used to do. This literature that comes from other places is this huge wealth of knowledge and experience and connection with other cultures. And I feel that possibly both our governments are, if not denying that, kind of deprioritizing it.
Yeah, I think you're right. But then I would encourage anybody in power to issue a statement saying you are forbidden to read Tolstoy to young people. It just backfires. And in the States, they're a group of, and I don't want to disparage, I have many friends who are devout Christians, but sometimes it's a Christian outcry years ago against Harry Potter or against the certain cartoon characters that seem a little bit too gender bending or whatnot. And invariably what happens is that the popularity of those things just shoots way up. It's the old reverse psychology thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You know who did that? It's a dear sort of Shakespearean and British actor. I think it was Helen Mirren, who was in one of our leading newspapers in the UK as saying, I think Shakespeare should be banned from schools. And of course, that's a great bit of clickbait, and it's a great grabby headline. Oh, Helen Mirren, started out with the RSC, famous for her acting there as well as on television and film, was a wonderful Prospero in The Tempest. And you think, oh, hold on, she's saying Shakespeare should be banned. And then you read a little bit more into the article, and it's exactly for that reason, Tom, saying, hey, if you don't let the under 16s have this, they'll want it.
They'll want it. Yep. It is part of a great tradition of British sustained irony. I think we had to learn about that.
Yep.
Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, right?
Yeah.
So yes, it makes perfect sense to eat babies.
It's either that or reverse psychology, or the interrelation of the two.
That's right. That's right. Well, this is just, I think we're going to survive, by the way. I'm very optimistic about that because the public demand, they're very vociferous clickbait people who are serious about getting their views and going after the egghead intellectuals, the snowflakes, what's the word, to own the left, make them mad. And they're driven to do that daily. But basically, when I can talk to friends of mine who have graduated in engineering sciences, who are doctors, and if I went and said, listen, for my undergraduate school, do you think they should just cut out Shakespeare altogether? Every one of them, and some of these guys are very conservative, would say absolutely not. I mean, that's the varnish in their minds. If nothing else, that's the varnish. You strip the varnish off the wood, you're taking value, right? It's like dropping your iPhone on the ground, right?
Yeah.
It's not as valuable with the glass cracked, and that's essentially what you're doing when you take these fields away from colleges and universities that wish to be universities, universal places of universal knowledge. But I want to get to your work here on, there's the World Educational Summit online, and let's not overlook that. That sounds big.
It does sound big, doesn't it? It is a huge undertaking, and I have to say, like, I'm contributing to one country's stage. So the way that it works is it is an online conference, meeting place, place to share presentations aimed at educators around the world, but particularly secondary school teachers across all subjects. So it really is, you mentioned universal and comprehensive education a minute ago. It really is going for that. And the stage that I say because it's a virtual stage, it's a virtual platform, is the Welsh stage. So here we have about 6 or 7 universities from across Wales, of which, Bangor is one, really trying to speak to Welsh educators about their research, right? The idea is that you put it out there in an accessible, approachable and applicable way. So how does your research relate to what teachers are doing in the classroom? For me, it's been a mission of relating the first nationwide UK survey of teaching Shakespeare that I undertook with Dr. Belder, Victoria Elliott at the University of Oxford from their education department, and thinking, what would teachers want to know from what we found? What do they want to know from this survey, particularly in relation to pedagogies and practices around Shakespeare? So we talked previously and published previously about the findings from this survey of what Shakespeare people do in the classroom and why. And one of the things I'd say that was really heartening about that, although it was Macbeth over and over again, is that there's also a huge range. So whilst Macbeth might have got the most kind of votes from teachers to use in the classroom, we also got mentions of teachers doing All's Well That Ends Well, or Titus Andronicus, and that was not what I was expecting to see. So, where you can give teachers the freedom, they will choose really interesting texts and they will choose them and be motivated to teach them, because there's got to be a reason that you think Titus Andronicus is going to work great with those year 10s. Otherwise, you don't do it. You've got to have a passion or an interest. So I thought that was fascinating. In this talk, we're particularly thinking about pedagogies and practices, and within that, thinking about during the 80s, 90s, noughties even, there was a lot of kickback against people like Rex Gibson, against my good friend James Stredder, the North Face of Shakespeare, those sorts of active methods, drama methods, practical methods, people saying, oh, this is going to take over the classroom, these active methods. There won't be any space left for reading the text. Students will become ignorant because they won't actually look at Shakespeare on the page. And it was this reactionary hoo-ha against these methods. Well, you know what we found? Many teachers aren't even aware of active methods. So that kind of fear that like these methods would come in and take over the classroom that needs to be thrown out the window. It's just not true. Now, it could be that teachers don't know the kind of brand or the name active methods, but actually they are doing role play, they are doing hot seating, they're doing balloon debates. That could be part of what's going on here. But actually, it's also around things like confidence, teacher confidence to use some of those methods. It takes a fair amount of confidence, right, to stand up and get people into groups and, shove your chairs to the back of the classroom. It can be quite a vulnerable experience as a teacher to do some of those things, to take those risks. So a lot of teachers talked about that. Also, teachers talking about funding. So they would have preferred to be able to bring someone, for example, from the Globe or the Royal Shakespeare Company into the classroom to head up that work.
Yeah.
Funding has been really tough to do that. So I think one of the positive developments for using some of these methods will be that places like the Royal Shakespeare Company and Shakespeare's Globe during the pandemic have been trying to find ways to connect with classrooms virtually and possibly at a slightly lower cost than is involved when you have to get on a train up to Newcastle.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I spoke a couple of months ago with Peggy O'Brien, who's director of education at Folger, and she talks about the Folger method, which essentially is very similar to what you're talking about, the active learning in classroom situations. And she began her career as a Washington, D.C. public, and that's a different normal school teacher in Washington, D.C., and had to revise everything in order to engage her students, which she eventually did. And we talked about that in that particular episode. She mentioned also, Jackie, is it Hanlo?
Hanlon, yeah.
Yes, and I want to maybe ask her to talk about just these things, because let's just face it, if I try to do acting in front of my class, and I have tried, just to demonstrate, and we do for the seminar classes, the smaller classes, we do, the students can work together and get a performance together of a short passage, and it all works very well. But if I could bring in an RSC actor for one class, it would be a game changer, because the power that you see, they're talking one moment, and a professional actor, you see that magical transformational moment where they go into character. And it is something when you can reach out and touch them, they're that close. And money for that would be money well spent.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst it is tricky to get that funding and to bring people internationally, I think, something about technologies in the pandemic, the impetus during the pandemic to kind of say, like, okay, let's not be snobby about Zooming people and bringing them into the classroom that way. Let's try not to see it as second best. Sure, it's different. You're not going to be able to necessarily reach out and touch them. Although there are some great blue screen technologies that people have been using. For example, I saw a presentation at the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry about someone who teaches their class in England in collaboration with someone else who teaches a class in Poland, and they come together via this blue screen technology to put on performances together from two separate sides of Europe. And, they stand in a semicircle in Coventry next to the screen, and in Poland they do the same, and it actually produces this whole circle. And they can do things like virtually pass objects or gestures, virtually throw gestures across the room to each other. So one of the things that I would love to have more opportunity to research is the impact of the pandemic and technology on teaching Shakespeare, the extent to which people have embraced in their classroom digital Shakespeares, whether that's performances from the National Theatre that have been made free, whether it's things like using the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive more to teach their classes, because you don't necessarily have Nina Gower's Macbeth coming to London anytime soon. but you can use these
Right.
archival, high quality, multilingually translated performances.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And traditionally, in the history of all of this, and I don't want to get to this is take a nap stuff, but copyright protection on a lot of these productions and so forth is for money making operations, big money. I understand, but in some cases, it absolutely just murders what otherwise could be a great moment in theater history. And fortunately, we have a number of tapes in our library that we can use, uh, and that sort of thing. It's just of immeasurable benefit in second language situations. And I've said before, everybody's in a second language situation when they come across Shakespeare. But for me to cover, some of this language, and I saw you do it here on campus with a sonnet, right, line by line. But we do that in class. But then you want to see the flow of the drama, and you can play a clip from Branagh's Hamlet with some Japanese subtitles, and that brings people in. These are portals and so forth. So we have. There was an article out about 5 or 6 years ago about the end of digital humanities, and guess what? It's back in. It's back
Oh,
in because
absolutely.
we've all had to go digital, and it's just going to get better. Like you're saying, people will, you look at the films, the history of film. The first films didn't look that they weren't that great, but people got good very quickly in developing techniques. I know at Carnegie Mellon that Steve Wittick and in cooperation with David McGuinness at the University of Melbourne have done a recent shrew in virtual reality, which is an interesting concept. And so these things are here, and more of these things are coming. And I think that you're right there on the cutting edge, Sarah, as always.
Absolutely. And you can see some Zoom Shakespeares from Japan. So, for example, Yu Mamiya, who's a graduate of Waseda and also the Shakespeare Institute, he has the Waseda Institute players who've been doing Zoom productions when they weren't allowed to get together and do rehearsals. And they've been so creative in the way that they retell these stories through an online environment, and maybe some of the ruses that need to be come up with for why particular characters are, dating online or whatever else it might be. But I definitely recommend those are up on YouTube if anyone just wants to find those Waseda Institute players Shakespeare productions. And I think there might be some other early modern drama bits and pieces that they're doing.
Well, good for him, and good for all of these efforts. There is a strong internationally, but there's a strong feeling in Japan that sometimes you have to protect a production and not give open access to it, and not have if you're doing a conference, for instance, not recording the lecture in the conference because it's just for members and that kind of thing. And there's a bit of that also, all across the world, but it's fairly strong in Japan. And I really have tried to argue against that because, again, you just kill something. It's a moment in time, and then you don't see it again. And do I wish they had set up just a few little angle cameras for Peter Brook's Antony and Cleopatra with Glenda Jackson? It's in my mind, but this sounds morbid going back to Gothic, but it dies with me, right? That memory dies with me. It doesn't live for others to see. There's a great production of Edward II. You talk about a pertinent play now, Marlowe's Edward II with Ian McClellan. And it's just, his Macbeth is very famous, but this performance, it just, and it's not exquisitely, Hollywood type film. It's just, they do the stage play, but they do camera angles very well in the 1970s. And it just knocks you out. It is amazing, So let's hope for more of this. And also because they filmed it, I have it. I can show it.
And you're right. You were saying, some people maybe in the ministry or some people around Japan are saying, well, why should we be doing this? Why should we look at these Shakespeare plays? But, you just mentioned that you can use these to talk about things like cinematic production over the era, or you can use them to talk about technology, or even, something more to do with critical literacy about, well, how was that put together? Why is it authoritative? Who gets to control what we see in that production?
Yeah.
These are all great critical questions that you can ask students who may well be the people producing NHK of the future or Netflix or anything else. So to get them to consider those questions through the lens of Shakespeare, if you're, going to make a call for it being applicable in the 21st century, that's one way to do it.
Or a depiction of a king of England who is wildly in love with a man. So much so that he brings this man of questionable background to court and keeps promoting him. And these, what seem to be, with homophobic nobles. But then as the play progresses, you hear a couple of times, listen, you can have your minions. You can do this, but you can't make him one of us. And that's the downfall, right? But you have that element in a 16th century play, right? Here, something, that would be very current, that could be done and moved into modern times very easily. Now, upcoming, Sarah, we have to go upcoming here. You have image and reproduction remediation, children's and young adults Shakespeare, in an encyclopedia entry, and word is out already that you're doing an issue for
Kaye Elizabethan.
Elizabethan. Okay.
No worries. We're doing a guest issue on Hot Shakespeare, Cool Japan, which, in a way, it's a kind of cheesy title, right? And it's entirely my responsibility. I don't want the weight of that to fall on Kaye or to fall on any of the people contributing to the issue. But, partly I thought I want something lively after, a kind of dull or bland couple of years for many of us. But I also quite like it because it recognizes those intercultural connections that we've got between Japan and the UK, because both governments, both nations have at particular times used this branding of cool Britannia, cool Japan around their tourism and cultural industries. So it's a little bit of a harking back to that in a tongue.
Well, there's nothing cheesy about the title at all. Some years ago when, who was the Prime Minister, Koizumi, the heat in Tokyo is so intense in August in particular. He basically let out the word to the entire business community that you can take off your tie in the summer and open your shirt collar, and you don't necessarily need a jacket. And he called it cool biz. It was cool biz.
I like it.
In English, cool biz. And so with the pun intended. And this is going to have resonance in Japan. The word cool is in Japanese, pronounced a little bit differently. And so I think you've landed a good title. And hot, there's some, hot can mean a lot of things. And,
it's so polyvalent, isn't it? We've been talking about sexuality a lot. So hot Shakespeare in terms of romance and sexual relationships. It could be hot Shakespeare in terms of, hey, if you're doing, original performance Shakespeare with original costumes, here in July and August, you're going to get pretty hot under those collars, under those ruffs. But also in terms of Shakespeare that has an electric charge, right? Shakespeare that is, I don't know, tasty or flying off the plate or having a hot moment, I guess. So hopefully it kind of, people can use it to connote whatever Shakespeare they think of as hot Shakespeare. It could also be Shakespeare that's really contested, right? People arguing over whether this play is Shakespeare or not, or arguing over the best way to stage Shakespeare in the 21st century. So it allows for some of that contestation as well. And I guess one of the things that I should do here, seeing as you've pretty much queued me up to do this, is to say that if anybody listening or viewing has got a short article, let's say around 4,000 words, and it's ready to go, and they've been, working away on it through this pandemic, maybe holed up in their lockdown, and they think, I really want a venue to get this 4,000 word thing about Japanese Shakespeare, or Shakespeare in Japan, or Shakespeare from Japan, or Shakespeare by an academic in Japan. You know, I'm taking this title and this umbrella very expansively. If they have that ready to go by July and they want to contact me, s.olive@bangor.ac.uk, and I know you're going to pop those communication channels up there, Tom. One of the things we did, there's a beautiful Shakespeare garden here. I don't know how famous the campus is at Kobe College, this beautiful hillside campus, which is really handy in that warm weather as well, because you get a nice gully breeze coming down off the hills. But there is a Shakespeare garden that over many decades was super carefully put together by now emeritus Professor Kinjo. And he brought, you know, seedlings and plants that are in Shakespeare's plays, in Shakespeare's poems, labeled them up, put quotations that pertain to them next to them. And it's this beautiful spot for lunch or a coffee, or just for kind of taking a book to read. It'd be really fitting if that happened to be a book of sonnets or a book of Shakespeare's plays, right smack bang in the middle of campus, right next to the literature buildings here on college. And what we're going to do is we're going to go out there. There's going to be a Shakespeare surprise sonnet draw. So I'm going to throw all of the numbers of the sonnets in a hat, and the students are going to pluck them out, and we'll read them in the order that they come for an hour. We'll have some music from Shakespeare's period, from his contemporaries on in the background. And if my cooking works, we're going to have some posset. We're going to have some lemon and lavender posset to delight our palates with. And, you know, to connect with things like the fact that there is lavender and edible flowers there. I'm not going to take the ones from the Shakespeare garden, because that would be awful mean, and they're just coming into bud. But, you know, it will allow students to engage with that Shakespeare garden and with Shakespeare's works in a multi-sensory way. So there's going to be audible delights, there's going to be tangible and gustatory delights, and also the pleasure of getting to speak and hear Shakespeare's language.
Yep. And put all of that, much of which was in the future tense, in the past tense.
Sorry, Tom, I'll go back through. This all happened. It was well received. The posset was deemed to be delicious, and it set perfectly in the fridge beforehand. There were no crises. And I turned up in some gear as an Elizabethan peasant woman. So any of you that have been to Mary Arden's farm or any of those kind of living history museums, you just imagine this woman with her skirts and her aprons and her big straw bonnet on, and that was me.
Oh, I'm sure it was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Well, to move, I want to make one little point, and it's the kind of drum that I have that I like to tap on for all these enormous hundreds of thousands of people who are watching. I'm joking, of course. The thing about Shakespeare and Japan, and I have co-authored, I spoke about this earlier in an article, but there was a little bit of contesting, and I wanted to talk about this just a little bit. And it's a little bit of a hot topic, in that there is from post-colonial reckonings, and Adele Lee, by the way, handles this extraordinarily well, as does Alexa Jobin. To make sure to point out the fact that Japan cannot be treated as a post-colonial cultural power. You don't. Japan does not have anything close to the history of, say, India or many African countries, or any of that. And in fact, Japan at points colonized other places. Yeah. And some would say, well, the Americans colonized. Well, okay. But there's an American military presence there, but you don't see it, not in Tokyo. And I'm sure they get instructed on not wearing their uniforms and walking around town or whatnot. And the point is that the government, I think a large portion of the government. Some do and some don't. In Okinawa, it's a hot issue. But basically, the status quo is it's probably good to have a little bit of help here because we have some big countries near us, and we don't know where that might go. All right, so in writing about this, I have, and I believe that my Japanese colleagues would take some offense in suggesting that there is a kind of post-colonial environment here, given the enormous economic strides Japan made after World War II, and given their prominence on the world economic and cultural stage. So it's so I had to make sure that was in a paper I recently wrote. That is a big thing. And people you can go right back to the Meiji period. From the very beginning, there was no inhibition in infusing Japanese culture with Shakespeare, right? Where there's somewhat, I don't know, it may have happened in a university where someone said, well, we can't wear kimonos, we have to wear these 16th century dresses, or we can't, we have to at least put on a top hat and look Victorian. Maybe that's more Shakespearean than our samurai. No, I can't, not anything that's lasted, and certainly not in Kurosawa or in Ninagawa. That has, it's Japanese Western fusion all the way through, and brilliant. And so I didn't want to make that point. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super point to make. And it's certainly one that we deal with in the Shakespeare in East Asian education book, because, we've got chapters dedicated to Hong Kong and Vietnam, which have admittedly very different colonial histories. So you've got British colonialism, you've got French colonialism, you've got, as you mentioned, in relation to Japan, but it's also applicable to Korea. You've got American troops occupying. And then in this book, alongside that, we have Japan, which has this distinct history, and a history of actually taking Shakespeare through various parts of Asia as a colonial force and in Japanese. So maybe Japanese translations of the Lamb's Tales, those sorts of things. So it is a point worth making, I think, about Japan having a rather unique relationship with Shakespeare, and one that harks back to that period of connecting to things that are seen as good about British culture. So whether that is, for example, Toyota looking to the industrial goods from the UK and thinking about how those might be replicated in Japan, or whether it's thinking about, I don't know, dress and fashion that you mentioned, and where they might fit into Japanese society and aesthetics, or whether it's kind of bringing over particular aspects of literature. And again, that's something that Professor Uchimari does so brilliantly in that chapter of Shakespeare in East Asia, is to look at, well, how was he received, and who was happy about teaching Shakespeare in higher education in Japan in the 60s, 90s. And he does, he tells a nuanced story around the embrace, but also a couple of words against that, or thinking about, for example, Soseke's not having a great experience with Shakespeare, but being kind of inescapably caught in a relationship with him that he, reflects on and uses in his creativity, even if that's with I'm not really sure about this Shakespeare stuff kind of note of reservation. So I think you're right to think about the very nuanced and complicated relationship that Japan has with Shakespeare, and ways that that's very different to Shakespeare in India and Hong Kong, where it, is required so that you can get a position within the civil service. That's a very different, hegemonically situation.
Yes, in India, that was very strong. And I just spoke with Edward Wilson Lee, who wrote about Shakespeare in East Africa. And he talks about how there was a two-tiered sort of Shakespearean reception in India that went into Africa, of course, because of the Indian, there were a number of Indian people who migrated into East Africa. And there was sort of a popular tradition that developed. And then there were the others who had to pass their civil service exam. So there was the iconic sort of Victorian version, but the winner with the public was the popular version, of course. It always wins. But anyhow, I want to make sure our audience, I'll make sure that in my quick little introduction before we begin, that you are available. You are available for talks, for work. We don't know this year exactly how travel within Japan is going to work. I think that it will be varied. I think that there will be colleges, universities that would love to have you come and visit on campus, and there may be others that have a policy of only students and professors into campus. But you are here and available either in person or on Zoom, and I know that there are a number of people who would love to see you in person. But if not, as we're saying, we have this option we're using now also.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Well, yeah, you're right. And the good thing about this option now that I'm on this side of the world is that I am on the same time as you. So it's a little easier if people want to Zoom with me in Japan. We're not having to deal with that 8-hour time difference or something. But yeah, absolutely. I am a traveling Shakespeare saleswoman. I have got in my briefcase 2 or 3 different papers that I can rock out at the drop of a hat, that I can tailor to your students and staff. And probably a note that I should throw in there is that this semester is a very gentle introduction to teaching in Japan for me. So I'm a little quieter this semester. Next semester, it's not that it's impossible, but it certainly hots up for me on the teaching front in semester 2. But I would absolutely love to make new connections and to revisit those old connections around Japan. And to be honest, on a slightly non-academic note, I'm heading back to Tokyo for a big steampunk event, super steampunker, that is happening in Chiba at the end of the month, just at the start of Golden Week. So that is certainly going to get me practicing my, aesthetic presentational skills. I'm going to be modifying my top hat, chucking a few gears on it to make sure that it fits in with that steampunk vibe. But again, that's another way of thinking about the influence of Industrial Revolution on popular Japanese culture, right? The way it gets integrated into steampunk anime and manga and so on. So yeah, I'm open to travel and exploring new ways of thinking about British and Japanese connections.
Well, thank you so much. We so much appreciate you giving over your time today to talk with us, because there will be a lot of us listening to you, and so here in Japan, and we just absolutely cannot wait to see you in person. Sarah, thank you again so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Tom, also. It's been an absolute pleasure to come on here and have this talk with you, partly because it's just lovely to talk with you anytime, any place, partly because I would recommend this experience to anyone that you invite out there, because it feels like an opportunity just to recap the positive things that have happened recently around your work. I know I mentioned this to you in an email, but it feels like the very best and most positive version of a performance development review, as we call them in the UK, that we have to do annually to make sure that we're still allowed our contract and those sorts of things. But doing this feels like the very best version of that.
Well, once again, thank you so much.